Hello and welcome to the Browns Blitz. Today is Wednesday, February 16th, and this is episode number 137. I'm your host, Rod Bloom. Joining me today is my brother, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, how are things going?
Man, they're going great, Rod. We hit 50 today.
You know, we hit 60 down here. So I'm not like trying to brag or anything, but it was pretty nice. So yeah, pretty happy.
Yeah. With any luck, by tomorrow I won't be falling on my butt on the ice.
Yeah. Joining us tonight is Doug Lesmerises. Doug, how are things going?
I'm doing well. I thought Jeff said we hit 50 today. I thought it was Jeff's 50th birthday, and he was doing a podcast. I was like, man, go out and celebrate your birthday.
No, Doug, that's way in the rearview mirror.
That hit a while back. Yeah.
Oh, it's temperature. Got it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So Doug, let's do a proper introduction. You are a writer, contributor for Cleveland.com, a host of Buckeye Talk Pod, and you have another podcast, CFB Survivor Show. I assume is that something that happens during college football season and during closer to the playoffs, or all the way through college football season, or what's the story with that?
We started it in July, and we're doing it twice a week, year round. So I have a co-host, Shahan Jeharaja, who's a college football writer for CBS Sports based in Texas. And we do focus on the college football playoff. We originally called it the College Football Playoff Show, but the actual college football playoff wasn't a huge fan of that name. So they suggested we adjust our name, and we agreed to do so. So it's the College Football Survivor Show, but we really just sort of look at the contenders for the playoff. We look at, teams and quarterbacks and coaches and programs that are in that contention. And we just had a podcast that is our latest podcast where we talked all about the issues, whether they will expand the playoff or not. So yeah, that's Tuesdays is Apple Podcast only. It's a subscription to that, and the Wednesday podcast is free, but we do that year round, and it's the College Football Survivor Show.
Excellent. And I have to bring up your book, and I'm going to say the whole title. It's The Road to Ohio State, Incredible Twists and Improbable Turns Along the Ohio State Buckeyes Recruiting Trail. That's been out for a little while, and I'll be honest with you, I don't have it yet. I haven't read it, but wanted to talk briefly about that too, kind of get a little bit about the backstory and how that came to be.
Yeah, so that came out in September. It's part of a series that was started with actually a recruiting book on Michigan, and then that was successful. They did one with Alabama, and then they called me and asked if I wanted to do Ohio State. And there's also a Georgia one that came out last year too. So it's individual recruiting stories of Ohio State players over the year. There's a Woody Hayes recruit in there, all the way up to Travion Henderson, who was a freshman on this most recent Ohio State team, and a bunch of guys in between. And it's all about, it's not their Ohio State careers, it's how they made the choice to attend Ohio State. So what other teams were recruiting them, the relationships they built, what their visits were like. So, Michael Jenkins, the guy who caught Holy Buckeye, is in there talking about when he visited Virginia Tech, and Michael Vick was his host and was driving him around. And Kenny Guyton's in there, and the miraculous story of he wound up a Buckeye, and Cam Hayward and Ryan Shazier and James Laurinaitis and Eddie George and the Bosa brothers. And so, I think it's 17 hopefully entertaining individual tales of how some of your more familiar Ohio State players made their choice to play in Columbus.
Excellent. And I know you have a link to that on your Twitter account, and people can follow you there and find that at Doug Lesmerises. And I was just listening to the podcast we did a couple of years ago, and I know you tell people to go to Doug Lesmerises.
Yes,
which is excellent.
Lesmerises, and you'll figure out how to spell it.
Excellent. So we're gonna talk a little bit of Buckeyes later related to the draft. I'm gonna shift right into the Browns. So this is a Browns podcast, so it's gonna be a lot of our talk this evening. And I wanted to get your thoughts first of all on just what it's like covering the Browns. And I'm not sure about this, so I wanted to clarify first. You attend the Browns pressers this year. How many years have you been doing that?
Oh boy. So I started off as an Ohio State beat writer and at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and was doing that exclusively for a decade plus. So I guess I really kind of came in with the Sashi era, I guess. So like I guess sort of like 2017 was probably the beginning of me starting to do a decent amount of Browns, maybe a little bit in 2016. I know I was very in on them tanking. So I remember writing a column way early on about like they need to tank, and then they tanked, and I was like, this is great. So yeah, it's probably been 5 or 6 years.
Have you been going to the pressers that long?
No, and I really probably got going to the pressers a lot in, I guess, the Hugh era. So I guess 17, okay. 18. I mean, I was there. Yeah. I mean, 18 was probably the year when Hugh and I were starting to disagree on some stuff. So yeah, 18 for sure. Maybe a little before that.
Okay. Excellent. I'm not looking to raise any kind of a stink here, but I'm kind of curious. I'm just kind of curious what it's like. People have opinions of the media and everything here. I'm just kind of wondering what the environment is among members of the media when you guys get together here, because obviously you work with your cowork. You have coworkers who are members of the media, so you guys are working together on things. When you're at pressers and when you're dealing with other members of the media, is it is it more competitive? Is it more like we're all in the same boat and people are trying to help each other? I'm just kind of curious what the environment is.
Yeah, I would say for the most part it's pretty collegial. Now I have a much sort of broader view on that at Ohio State, where I've never been a Browns beat writer, so having been an Ohio State beat writer for so long, but being around the Browns, I do think Mary Kay Cabot really just, I think, sets a tone in a lot of ways with how many stories she breaks and just sort of how thorough and just on top of the beat that she is. And then Dan Labbe right beside her. Those are the two people for us who are really all over it on an everyday basis. And I would say Scott Petrick and Nate Ulrich do the same things for their outlets. Tom Withers is really good from the AP, but I do think, the comprehensive day-to-day, making sure all the bases are covered. I do feel like there are multiple super professional people who do that. And they do, I think, I don't know if work together is the right word, because they want to beat each other and they want to break stories. But I do think they work like a pack. I don't know if that sounds right, but to make sure everything's asked, right? Mm-hmm. That, okay, we need to make sure we ask about the tight end injury. Okay, you asked about that. Well, I'll make sure I ask about if they're going to change, something at safety. And someone needs to ask about Joe Woods. Oh, good, you asked about Joe Woods. And I feel like most of the time, in the NFL, you talk to people so much that they really are on top of stuff, and there's not much that slips through the cracks. But that it is mostly friendly, competitive, but friendly with the way those people go about their business.
So you guys pretty much know what the other writers are going to ask beforehand.
I think a lot of times, again, I am usually, when I'm doing the Browns, coming from left field with stuff that I'm trying to bring something. I'm trying to ask something that I figure other people aren't asking, mm-hmm. or if I feel like I don't care if people think I'm a jerk because I don't have to work the beat and build relationships quite the same way. So if somebody really needs to be pressed on something, I want to be there, and I'm not trying to like stir up stuff necessarily, but if I feel like this has got to be asked, I want to make sure I'm at the presser. And so much has been on Zoom, it makes it a little easier. But I want to jump in and make sure I'll push somebody on something if I feel like maybe other people aren't going to do that. So I don't know that people know what the other people are going to ask, but I think the beat writers all know these 6 areas need to be covered today.
Yeah.
And they work together to make sure all 6 get covered.
I think when you twist, you kind of do it in like a kind of professional way. So it's kind of, I don't think they can really get mad at you. So
you got mad. But
Hugh, he probably got mad at everybody.
But I want, like, they're millionaires. It's okay if they get mad. I'm not trying to make people mad, but I'm not afraid to make people mad. And
you're doing your job. Yeah.
Sometimes I take not pride, but I put a lot of thought into the way I ask a question, because I do think sometimes just generally in the media, there's a topic that needs to be covered. We need to cover, why isn't Ronnie Harrison playing better? He seemed to blow a coverage the other day. Well, if you want to, you've got to ask that the right way to possibly get an answer. And so the way you phrase it, sometimes you need to be short and quick and to the point and really push somebody and risk making them mad. Sometimes you need to massage it a little bit. Sometimes I feel like you need to take the possible cliche answer and put it in the question so they can't throw it back in your face and say, I know that it's a collaborative effort and everybody's doing their best out there, but that kind of thing. But sometimes I don't want to make people mad necessarily, but sometimes if they do get a little mad, if you're not being unfair, sometimes people are the most honest when they're a little mad. And so
True.
If I just say, Kevin, do you feel like you're coaching as well this year as you did last year? There's something in a question like that is basically me saying you're not doing a very good job this year. Mm-hmm. But I want to see where he goes with that, and I want to see if he does get mad. So I do think, and that's where I want to come in, because sometimes the beat writers really are so busy with the day-to-day stuff that has to be covered. They have to use their questions on that. The big picture stuff, sometimes I feel like that's where somebody in my type of job can come in and say, okay, I'm not going to ask about the daily minutia because the beat writers are doing a great job with that. I'll go big picture and see how somebody reacts.
Yeah. Makes sense. Total. I just wanted to get some thoughts from you on the 2021 season. Just because we haven't talked since then. We on this podcast, we've kind of put that in the rearview mirror, but we haven't had you on. So just kind of your general thoughts, maybe what I think everybody knows the season was a disappointment. Everybody thought the Browns were going to do better. I think we know that the Baker's injury was a big factor in everything, but I guess maybe just what stood out this season, and what other things were the differences between 2020 and 2021?
Well, certainly the efficiency on offense and Baker working within Kevin Stefanski's game plan with the boots, with the play action, the stuff that brought out the best of Baker in the second half of 2020. Obviously that didn't continue. It is one of the more difficult sports seasons to analyze that I've been around, because when the quarterback injures himself so early in the year, yet continues to play, and all year we're doing, well, of course he's affected by the injury, but how much? It's not the throwing shoulder. Well, now he has a harness on. What is it? I think that was really difficult week to week in the moment, and it's still difficult knowing what we know now, and that certainly the way they talked at the end of the year really made it seem like it was a bigger issue than maybe they were making it seem like in the moment. But I do think fundamentally, in a league where the best teams throw it to their receivers to move the ball and score points, it feels like the Browns have fallen behind there. And that's not only a Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase kind of thing, but you look at so many of the teams in the playoffs, and defense is great, and building with the offensive line is great, and the run game is great. But the way Baker played, the way Baker processed the throws Baker didn't make and did make, regardless of the injury, and the lack of production from the receivers, the way the Odell thing unfolded, I think there are real questions that are very answerable. But I certainly have questions beyond the injury about, can Baker Mayfield and Kevin Stefanski and whatever they do at receiver, can they evolve to the point where they threaten defenses in the passing game the way many other good teams do? And is the Stefanski model of run it, throw it to the tight ends, that kind of offense, is that really the best way for the Browns to win at the highest level, not just in the regular season, but in the playoffs? So I think, injury aside, those are the questions that they have to answer and show us, I think, a little bit at least of a different version of themselves with how they choose to throw it, the kind of play calls that Stefanski has. And I know people would point to film and say, hey, receivers were running open a lot and Baker didn't throw to them. But whatever it is, I get a little sick of the trying to figure out where the blame goes. Is it Baker's fault or Stefanski's fault? They couldn't throw it, and they have to fix that. And I don't think that is 100% injury related. So I have real questions about that for 2022.
Yeah, and throwing the ball is kind of a theme that we're going to keep coming back to tonight.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, we've talked about it a lot, Doug. I mean, Rod and I, this podcast is really not about dissecting, individual players and stuff. We try to do an overall assessment of where the team is, and that's kind of where I come from. It's what's the culture, what's changing, and so forth. I want to ask you about your perceptions of that. This coming from obviously the Hugh Jackson era until now, you've seen some changes in the culture. And what do you think that the organization is doing right? And what do you think the organization is doing wrong in terms of building a sustainable winning culture?
I do believe that all the stuff everybody talked about when Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry were hired and all the alignment discussions were real and are happening. And so I think there is a baseline level of competence and a baseline level of, not tearing each other's heads off in the building that should not be extraordinary, but given the recent past of the Browns, was a major step forward. And so I do think they're all on the same page. I think they're smart. I think they're comprehensive. I think they don't take anything for granted. I do think there is just they can win. They are capable of winning with the way they are doing things now. And then the hard part of that is when there's been such dysfunction, not just with Hugh Jackson, Sashi Brown, not just with John Dorsey and Freddie Kitchens, but, just dating back. That's what's defined the Browns since they came back to Cleveland. So they're competent and functional, but then what? Then that's not good enough. And I do think that there can be a divide in the fan base sometimes of, hey, Baker took us from 1-31 to here. Why is everyone trying to get him out of town? And it's like, well, it's not really about that they once were 1-31, although that was important for them building this. I do believe that. But so now you're trying to get the Super Bowl. You're not just trying to be competent. And you're not just trying to make the playoffs. You made the playoffs. So now what? So to me, the discussions with the Browns now are, is it good enough to win a Super Bowl? Does it beat the Chiefs? Does it beat the Bills? Does it beat the Bengals? Does it win a second round playoff game? The idea of, maybe you can play this way and do it this way and go, 11-6 and make the playoffs. I'm not going to say that's not good enough, but it's not the ultimate goal. So I do think there's been a shift for everybody. That's a heck of a transition to go from dysfunction to let's put the playoffs as almost an expectation. But I think that's where we are. So then you have to analyze them through now to how do they get to the next step? And that's when you start talking about, well, they need to throw it better. Well, is Stefanski leading the right way in the locker room, why they have to draft a receiver. And, when people are getting on Joe Woods and clearly the defense played the second half of the year, it's not, are you competent? It's, are you Super Bowl level? And I think that's a good shift that's happened in Cleveland, but I think that's a necessary shift. And I don't think there's any doubt that they're good. They're good. This is a good franchise right now. Are they Super Bowl level? That's where we all need to talk and sort of ask where they can get better.
I think a lot of work has to go into that still. So just as a follow-up on Stefanski, he's used this phrase, tough, smart, and accountable. Do you see that being developed in players, or do you think that is a requirement to play for Kevin Stefanski?
How do I answer that? I mean, I don't, it doesn't feel like the roster is populated by a bunch of guys that you can't trust, right? So I do,
right.
But also, you got to draft talent. So you need to build a structure. At the highest level, Bill Belichick brought in a ton of guys who maybe had questions with other franchises. And then you have such a structure and a culture in place that guys get in line when they get in your building. So I'm not saying Kevin Stefanski needs to emulate the greatest coach of all time immediately, but I do think there's an area where you should be able to get anybody to follow it, to follow along on that. I don't think they have to come ready-made like that, because there's a lot of talented players that might have a little bit of a, I don't know what you want to call it, a wild streak or something, but they just need the right kind of leadership. So I would hope that, and that's not the kind of guys who are doing a bunch of terrible stuff off the field and getting in trouble with the legal system and that kind of thing. But it's just like Odell. I would not define Odell. I mean, Odell has never done anything wrong off the field. It's just do you think, he wore a watch, or like he likes to train his own way. If you're a great coach, you should be able to get the best out of Odell Beckham Jr. without him, lining up and having to act like you're a drill sergeant. So I do think that was some failing of the organization that they couldn't make that work, because I don't think they have to come ready-made. I think Kevin Stefanski needs to be able to create a structure that brings out the best of a lot of different players with a lot of different personalities.
I kind of personally tend to think that he needs players to come more ready-made at this point in his career. I think you're right. The level of aspiring to be Bill Belichick, maybe he can get there at some point in his career. Obviously, Bill Belichick wasn't that way when he was here, right, early in his career. So I think looking at the players that are on the roster now, that's probably part of the divide, don't you think, is that some of these guys are ready to toe the line and follow that philosophy, where other guys need a little bit or maybe a lot more guidance. And that's not necessarily a strength of this staff. Would you agree with that?
So I guess, so they took a chance on Malik McDowell, right? A guy who had some issues.
Good example.
On him. They bring him in. He's a starter. He actually doesn't play that well. They need to be better at defensive tackle. He's fine. I mean, they feel, it seems like they want to be a franchise that isn't afraid of guys like that we think we can do that and give guys second chances. I do think with Kevin, and I do not know Kevin all that well, I do think Kevin, and I've made this analogy before, in the COVID year when there was so much crazy stuff and you couldn't meet and everybody was behind, for them to have the kind of year they did with the first-year head coach and make the playoffs in the COVID year, it felt like he was a calm in the storm, right? And navigating through the storm. But then, when it's not a storm, do you want calm all the time? Like I do. Maybe it's just the perception of his personality in press conferences. But, the little snippets where you see, John Harbaugh on the sideline saying, Lamar, you want to go for it? Yeah, coach, let's go for it. Like that kind of thing. You watch that, and I know it's a little NFL film snippet, but I watch that sometimes and I think, would Kevin Stefanski do that? Or you watch Sean McVay interact and fist pump and, celebrate with the guy on the sideline. And I think, does Kevin Stefanski do that? And there's lots of ways to get a job done. But I thought he was like the perfect guy for 2020 in that weird year. But long term, when they're trying to be great. And when you have great talent, you might have a couple difficult guys. I do have questions about him navigating that and navigating egos and
Right.
bringing a locker room together. And when John Johnson III at the end of the year is saying, like, man, the offense and the defense weren't necessarily on the same page, that's on Kevin. So
Yeah.
I think we all need more from Kevin Stefanski. He had a great first year, but I know some people think, oh, well, this second year there were so many injuries. That was a fluke. How do we know the first year wasn't the fluke? So I'm not trying to fire Kevin Stefanski, but I am not assured that he is a brilliant long-term NFL coach based off the first 2 years. He seems to have good attributes, but I feel like there's things he needs to do better.
Yeah, I think that
and you hope that there's enough alignment in the organization that they can pull him through that learning curve as well, right?
Right.
Or if it, in 2 years, if you can't pull him through, then get somebody else. It's like, it'd be great if he's a coach for the next 20 years. But, there are two such strong examples in the division with Mike Tomlin and John Harbaugh. And nobody listening to this needs that explained. You know what Mike Tomlin's all about, and you know what John Harbaugh is all about. And they are smart, tough, and accountable. I think what Kevin Stefanski says he wants the Browns to be, I feel like that's right where you would start with those two coaches and the cultures of those two teams. And yes, Stefanski is young, but I don't feel like they're there. I just think that, and again, Odell had problems in New York, and I don't mean to bring up Odell, but we're talking about Kevin. I don't hold Kevin responsible, and we talk about this a lot in the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. The way it ended isn't Kevin's fault. The fact that it got to that point, part of that's Kevin's fault. And that Kevin let it get to the point where the dad posts the video and Odell's that frustrated and all those things. I think other coaches very well might have managed it better. I'm not saying every coach, but I don't think it was like the most impossible player situation in the NFL last year. And it blew up in their faces. And I think a little bit of a firmer hand or better leadership or better player relationships, I think might have been able to nip that in the bud before it reached the point it did.
Yeah. And, it was kind of shocking for me because it seemed like the Browns really didn't have or weren't having any issues that weren't being handled behind closed doors before that. So I was under the impression that Stefanski was doing a nice job of, massaging egos and things like that, before that happened. So hopefully it's something he can learn and I guess follow the learning curve, like Jeff's saying. And hopefully he'll get a chance to do that because just like quarterback, I think a team's better if you have some longevity. If you're able to have the longevity of the head coach, it's going to help the franchise. But guess see what happens.
And he very well may be the guy. I am not trying to run the guy out of town at all. But but he needs to be better. And we might look back and say, man, remember how Kevin Stefanski missed the playoff in year 2 and then they made the playoffs 8 straight years? That's possible. And there is a learning curve. I get it. But I just don't. I mean, if there's anybody who thinks like he did a great job last year, and it's a straw man argument. I don't know. There's a ton of Browns fans who think that, the tackles were injured. It's not his fault. Man, I thought there was stuff he could have done better.
Yeah. So
we don't make excuses for coaches, only players, Doug.
That's right.
Right. So let's talk about the first article that we wanted to bring up that you wrote. I think this was probably about a week ago, and that's where the Browns could match the path of the Bengals and what the Browns need to learn. And this was very interesting because you threw a lot of numbers out in this article, and a lot of research, a lot of comparing the Browns to the Bengals, and what it came down to is the Browns this past season were better than the Bengals in a lot of areas, almost every area other than the passing game.
Yeah.
And we bring up the passing game again, and it's funny, Doug, because when I listened to the podcast we did, over a year ago, I asked you about Nick Chubb, and within a few minutes you were talking about the passing game. because you're like, well, Nick Chubb's good, but he's not going to run us to a Super Bowl. It's about the passing game, and it's a passing league, and we've known it's a passing league for a while, but this past season has really seemed to highlight the fact that it's more about passing even than we thought it was, is kind of how I see it.
And I think it's about that, like when it matters against good teams. I do think the running game and defense can probably get you to the playoffs and can beat a lot of mediocre teams. And that's because we've seen how good the Browns are when they get a lead. And part of the issue this year was they didn't get as many leads. But if they get ahead and we all know what the formula is. Wear them down with Nick Chubb in the fourth quarter. Yeah. But that's harder to do against Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and Aaron Rodgers and Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert. So, they were efficient throwing the ball in 2020. You can look at a lot of numbers where, their passing EPA compared to the running EPA, they were really efficient. And then in 2021, they were like a backwards team. They were more explosive running it. They couldn't throw it at all. And we sort of all know the reasons for that. But the thing that I would love to have a long-term conversation with Andrew Berry and Paul DePodesta and Kevin Stefanski about is they are kind of an outlier in what they do. I guess the Titans are kind of like them, but that they are so run heavy. Is it good to be different, or does it reach a point where it's bad to be different? Because a lot of times I think being different is the underdog answer. When you don't have the same talent, you don't want to do it the same way everybody else does. Because it's like, well, man, if we just do what everybody else does, we don't have Tyreek Hill. Well, we don't have Travis Kelce. We don't have Patrick Mahomes. So we better do something different. So then you do something different. But at some point, when you have Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah and Jadeveon Clowney and Joel Bitonio and Nick Chubb and David Njoku and Jack Conklin and John Johnson III, you have enough talent. So maybe don't be different. Maybe do it the way everybody's doing it. So that's where I'm really curious about what those front office thinkers would say about that idea, because I am sort of out on different. And I keep saying on our Orange and Brown Talk podcast, I don't want to see any more 6-yard passes to the tight end. Like, I get it, but I don't think that's the overall winning formula. So let's get some receivers in here. Let's see what Baker does when he's healthy and be prepared with other options pretty quickly. I'm not saying you bench him in week 3 of this year, but this guy's not signed. So, they don't have all their eggs in the Baker Mayfield basket. If they did, they would have extended him. So you have to be ready with a wide-ranging view of the quarterback situation. You have to get receivers to make any quarterback better, and let's see what happens. Because I don't think the other thing is sustainable the way it is right now. And I almost feel bad for the Browns because they sort of built it the right way. They built it with the offensive line, and the Bengals are like, hey, our line stinks. Let's draft that guy from LSU and see what happens. And it's like, oh, the Super Bowl. It's like the Browns did it the right way, and it didn't matter. The Bengals are getting Joe Burrow sacked 10 times a game, but they got him his favorite receiver from college, and they're good to go. So I don't blame the Browns for where they are, but I'm going to blame them if they don't add to the receiver room big time. And if they don't start doing that more, because you can't draft a receiver at 13 and not throw to him. And the way that they were not getting the ball to Odell Beckham, yes, Baker's injury was part of it, but it's a malfunction, right? How do you not get the ball to a guy like that in a league like this? How do you not get him the ball? There's no excuse for it. So they have to fix that. And I just can't see them winning a Super Bowl. It's like, what's your plan for the Super Bowl? Throw it to Austin Hooper 4 times in the first quarter and hope that we're up 19-12 in the fourth quarter so we can run Chubb 12 times. It's like, that's not the league, man. You've got to adjust to reality.
And you're right.
Confident,
how
confident you think Kevin Stefanski would be knowing that his job is on the line next year, that he's got to figure out a passing offense through the arm of Baker Mayfield?
I mean, it is. I feel bad for all of us to some degree, and by all of us, I mean everybody who talks or thinks and cares about the Browns fans first and foremost, and then guys like us, because we don't know. Like, it's the only thing that matters in a lot of ways, and we don't know, because he's been good at times. And you look at some of the stuff, I know like there were some numbers on Malik Willis from the Senior Bowl, and like I think his miles per hour on something on how hard he threw it, and like a list of recent quarterbacks, and like Baker's like right there. So it's like, arm strength, and it's like that guy can zip it in perfect scenarios, right? But off platform, and it's just the decision making this year, man. I'm sure the injury affected the decision making, but there are a number of times that he did not throw to guys that were open, and he did throw to guys that were covered and got picked. That is worrisome to me, injury or not. And so, and when he's been good, he really hasn't been like, he hasn't had a whole entire very good year. He's had very good spurts in different years. So, but the proof's in the pudding. They haven't signed him. And that was the whole Mayfield Matrix series we did. They just teams with the quarterback 5th-year option. Like this doesn't work. This has not ever happened where you do not extend him before year 5 and then he winds up being your long-term quarterback. It's never happened with a first-round quarterback. So maybe they will plow new ground here, but if they really believed in him, he'd be signed and none of us would be having this conversation. So for the people who get mad about hating on Baker, it's like, listen, man, it's not my fault the team didn't sign him. I understand why they didn't, but this is not normal. If the Bills signed Josh Allen, they're not having this conversation in Buffalo. So that uncertainty permeates everything they do, and it's going to make for an interesting season. But I think it's going to make for a frustrating, next 7 months in trying to analyze this because we're not going to know until he gets on the field.
Yeah, kind of feels like a shotgun marriage to me
between Stefanski and Mayfield.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard because there's been, because of all the coaches and OCs Baker's been through, and then the injury. It's hard to tell what else you can put blame on and how much is just inconsistency.
And the thing that I said is like, no offense, but like I don't really care about Baker Mayfield. I care about the quarterback of the Browns because I don't cover Baker Mayfield. I cover the Browns. And I don't write and talk for Baker Mayfield fans. I write and talk for Browns fans. So my concern is the quarterback of the Browns. And can he be good enough for the Browns to win a Super Bowl? He doesn't have to carry him there by himself, but can he be good enough? Can Baker Mayfield be that guy? I don't know. But it's not about whether it's fair to Baker Mayfield. Yes, he's had a bunch of coaches and OCs. Yes, he was injured. The reality is he's not signed in year 5, and he was bad last year. We know why. Part of the reason he was bad. It wasn't the entire reason, though. But yes, we get it. But it's not. No offense to the millionaires. It's not about what's fair to them. It's about what's best for the franchise. And if we don't think the franchise is incompetent, and I don't think most Browns fans do anymore. I don't think they look at Andrew Berry and Paul DePodesta and Kevin Stefanski and the Haslams now. I think the Haslams have really redeemed themselves the last year or so, basically by hiring good people and getting out of the way. But I don't think people look at that and think, well, they're going to screw it up. And if you do think that, I don't think that's fair. So I think you believe they're going to make the right decision, but they can't make a decision on what's best for Baker Mayfield. They have to make it on what's best for the Browns. So I do get frustrated. I don't get frustrated. I am curious sometimes about fans who seem to be more of a fan of Baker Mayfield than they are of the Browns. But I think that is rooted in a mistrust of the organization that has been justifiably built up by incompetence and mismanagement over an extended period of time. That if you doubt the Browns, if that's bred into you, I get it. And you like what this guy brought to the city. But I don't think they're incompetent, and I'm not sure how good the quarterback is.
I think there's so many things because I think, and I think I'm in the same spot. To me, it's best if Baker succeeds and we have an answer at QB. Okay, I think that's the best path, even though there's going to be a major expense in extending him. If he has a great season this coming season. But I think you got people on the one end that are like, well, we finally got a guy who's better than all these other guys, and they're thinking of the jersey, the quarterback jersey.
Right.
And then, and the other argument is just as well, because they're like, well, look at the other quarterbacks who are out there. and how good they are compared to compared to what we have in Baker right now as far as what we know about him. So there really is no right answer to this right now.
No, I mean, and the issue is everybody thinks they're right, me included. I mean, what the heck? I'm a columnist. I always think I'm right. So that's okay. We're all sometimes we can be all of us a little certain in our opinions when the whole point of this situation is uncertainty. But I do think one of the issues is I believed in Baker. I thought he was the right pick at number 1. I was scared of Josh Allen. Josh Allen has become more accurate than I ever would have expected. I thought he was the right pick. I thought he was the right guy going into last year. So, I'm not anti-Baker at all, but I'm going by how he played last year. And again, not just the injury, but his upside, I think at his best, he's borderline top 10. Because every year we just did a ranking on the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. We drafted the best quarterbacks in the league, and it's not an affront to him, but he's never going to be Patrick Mahomes, right? And he's never going to be Justin Herbert probably, and he's never going to be Aaron Rodgers, and that's okay. But I think his upside is like the 10th best quarterback in the league, and then there's the uncertainty that if he's missing reads and he's not seeing open guys. So I think, for instance, Kirk Cousins is better than Baker? I don't know if I think he's better. I think he's more certain. So if the upside of Baker is 10th, the upside of Baker is the 10th best quarterback in the league, or 9th. But the downside that we saw this year was like the 25th best quarterback in the league.
Yeah.
If you get Kirk Cousins and you're like, you know what? I'm pretty sure he's the 17th best quarterback in the league, or the 14th best. And if we have for sure the 14th best quarterback in the league in 2022, we're making the playoffs. That's where I think the issue is. Is Kirk Cousins going to get you to a Super Bowl? I don't know. But he's more certain than Baker. And if you're questioning Baker's upside, then what are you hanging on for? Which is then why I'm interested in what's next. Maybe. I'm not trying to push Baker out of town. But if he's not signed, you have to have another possible idea in your head for 2023 right now, because they don't have a quarterback on the roster signed for 2023 as it stands.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So you also put out your first mock draft. Was it yesterday, I believe, right? Tuesday,
yeah.
Yeah. So and you had a trade in the mock draft. First round, you had the Browns taking Garrett Wilson at 13, and you kind of said you would, you're going to take your favorite receiver there, I guess, depending on who's there. You would take London or Burks, depending on who's available, more than likely, right? So,
right.
And then you had the Browns trading back into the first round and picking 29th. Giving up pick number 44 and their second rounder in 2023, and taking Desmond Ridder out of Cincinnati, quarterback. Right. So you won't get an argument here from Jeff or I, because I have my third kid at UC right now, so I watched every UC game this season. So
nice.
I know he's not a finished product, but I think looking at this class, I think he's a pretty good guy that could come in, and be developed. I know he's got a few issues, but he's got good size, and and he can run, and he can do a lot of things. So I think for me that's a pretty nice pick. And then with the 2 third rounders, you had Boye Mafe, edge out of Minnesota, and Charlie Kohler, the tight end out of Iowa State. So I think you're hitting, pretty much the main spots that most everybody who's doing mocks is thinking about. Other than, not everybody's going to take a quarterback in those first 4 picks. But yeah, so Jeff, why don't you jump in here, Jeff, with some of your thoughts on on the mock. Jeff's been studying the draft a lot. I'm trying to get up to speed on this stuff, Doug, but I'm kind of behind some of you guys on this. So
that's all right.
Yeah. So
I'm working hard, but I'm not there yet.
There's still a lot of time for individual players in the draft. I think it's really early to be hanging your hat on somebody right now. So I'm not going to go into, why I think a guy's a good pick or a bad pick at this point in the process. But just in terms of the thinking about, who you draft where, okay, and why. One of my concerns is, the Browns historically have drafted for need. They've tried to solve their problems by finding guys in the draft. And I just wonder how successful you can be doing that. When you might pass over better players to take a guy who addresses a problem with your roster. So let me frame the question this way. Okay. I mean, if let's just say, for argument's sake, we didn't take a wide receiver with our first pick in the draft. Okay. And I know everybody's saying we need to, but what players or what type of player, not maybe even a specific player, but what type of player would make you not take a wide receiver with the 13th pick in the first round?
Nobody. I have no answer to that question.
let me go a little bit further, and maybe it'll spark a thought in your mind. Okay. Let's just say that the Browns took Garrett Wilson, as you suggested, okay? And I think Garrett Wilson has a lot of that boom or bust in his makeup as well, depending on the team he ends up with. I think that's part of the problem with this draft in general, is that there are very few players in this draft who strike me as the kind of guy who is going to step in and be outstanding in his first season. I think this draft has a lot of, Batman or Robin to Batman, okay, in the makeup of a lot of the players. So I look at it like, as an example, Tyler Linderbaum, and I've talked a lot about Tyler Linderbaum on this podcast. People are probably sick of hearing me throw his name out there. But if he was anything but a center, if he played any other position on the football field, I think he would be the number one pick in this draft if you look at his resume. And, you can agree or disagree on that. But if I'm sitting there and my choice is between a player who may or may not be good enough to be my number one receiver, might be my number two receiver when I really need a number one receiver, or a guy who I think could potentially be a Hall of Fame player, is it the best use of my draft capital to take a guy just because I need that guy at that position? Or should I be taking the best possible player with that draft pick?
Yeah, it's the name of the game is not draft the best players, it's build the best team. And positional value is, I think, really important in this kind of thing. And this is a bad example because left tackle is super important, but the Browns had a Hall of Fame left tackle for a decade and sucked. And it's because they didn't have enough other good players at other positions that mattered.
Unfortunately, that was the one they hit on, right?
Yeah. So, if they take Tyler Linderbaum at 13, I'm going to, set the draft room on fire. No offense. Because how does that make them a better team? They've already invested more money in their guards than any team in the NFL. They already have huge capital spent on both tackles, and they have a veteran at center and a guy in Nick Harris that they drafted behind him who should be ready to step in at some point, which is a really good use of a 5th-round pick. That would make them overly strong at offensive line. You're adding to a strength for what, and then who are you going to throw to? So if you do that, I just don't see how any position would help them as much as taking a receiver. And I think Garrett Wilson is number one. And actually, I think Garrett Wilson is super smart. I think he has not shown how good he can be at Ohio State because he wasn't an offense with 3 really good receivers where they spread the ball around. I think he's a good route runner. He's 6'1". He has a big catch radius. He wins balls in the air. You can get him involved in the run game. He can play in the slot. He can play outside. I think he's a true number 1, and I think he helps you from day one. And you don't draft him because of this, but he went to the same high school as Baker Mayfield. So if you're trying to make Baker Mayfield feel better, you're giving Baker Mayfield a little friend who's a great player, but they're also going to have an immediate connection. And like you said, I'm great with Drake London, 6'5". I'm great with Treylon Burks, physical guy, 6'3". But I don't want a speed guy. I don't want a deep threat. I want a number 1 receiver that they can throw the ball to all over the field, and the guy can get 10 targets a game and catch 7 of them. Because if you look through the NFL, and I haven't done this project yet, but just anecdotally, almost every number 1 receiver you think of was drafted to that team. Now, Stephon Diggs in Buffalo is an exception, but Devontae Adams starts with the Packers. DK Metcalf, Seattle. With Julio Jones, I'm running out of, but like
Tyreek Hill, guys like that. Yeah, Tyreek Hill and Chase.
Like the Jamar Chase. Like there's just, you do Tyreek Hill, you do that. You draft a guy and you groom him in your system. And I do think with Stefanski's system, to bring in a receiver from somewhere else, and I also do think they should sign a receiver. You can't bring in an Odell, who was used to being a number 1 guy in a passing offense, and then bring him here and say, hey, we throw the tight end all the time. You have to bring in a guy who doesn't know any better, and you groom him in your system. And they're overdue to draft a receiver. They haven't drafted one since Corey Coleman. Since then, they've drafted an edge rusher. They've drafted a tackle. They've drafted a cornerback. They've drafted a quarterback. They've drafted every positional, the most important positions they've addressed in the first round since Corey Coleman. They haven't gone to receiver. It's time for receiver. And I think, thankfully, the strength of that position group matches their need. So I get you don't want to overextend on need, but I think Wilson, Burks, and London, none of them are going in the top 5. I think they're all going to go between 10 and 20. And I think 2 of those 3 will be available at 13. And so I do think, just like with Greg Newsome, just like with Jedrick Wills, I think that the guys available at the position, good for the Browns, matches their need. But I just don't. What else would make them? What else would help them more? What position could help them more? They draft David Ojabo and have pair a guy at edge rusher with Myles Garrett. Okay, I get it. That's great, but that's going to make them a better football team in 22 than getting a number 1 receiver, a starting receiver for a team that has no receivers. That's why I'd love to hear the argument, because I understand what you're saying, but what makes them a better team than drafting a potential number 1 receiver at 13? I just can't think of any other guy.
No, I am not disagreeing. I think from as you mentioned earlier, positional value perspective, a 13th pick in the draft, which is someplace you hope to not be again anytime soon.
Yeah.
Needs to be a diamond type player on your team. And you need to be sure that player is going to have a huge impact on your team for the long term. You're getting a 5-year contract at a very good price.
Yeah.
Where, yes, to go out and you can go out and pick up a Jadeveon Clowney to play opposite Miles. Okay. But that comes with a huge cost, and that limits what you can do in other places. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago about, yes, we took a cornerback last year. Okay. But this draft also has some really, really good cornerbacks up high. And we're looking at extending Denzel Ward at huge money. Okay. So, I follow the idea that, they're due to take a wide receiver. I also think that, the way this draft sets up with so much depth, I'm in favor of taking 2 wide receivers. Honestly, I would say 2 of the first 4 picks ought to be wide receivers. And if they decide to take, other positions in the first and second round, I want those 2 picks in the third round to be wide receivers who are probably going to be better than anything we have on our roster now.
But they just took a receiver in the third round last year who doesn't know how to play receiver.
Yeah, he sucks.
Like
I
was a fan of his. Yeah, yeah.
He doesn't know how to play receiver. Like he doesn't know what to do.
You have to actually finish a route.
so that's what listen, I'm on what's the guy's name? I'm on Ray St. Brown. When 10 picks after Anthony Schwartz and had 1,000 receiving yards in Detroit or whatever. Detroit stinks and didn't have anybody else to throw it to. But it's one of those things. Everybody has examples of, oh, don't take this position high because you can find a guy later. It's true everywhere. But I do think Wilson and London in particular, to me, profile as there's no such thing as a sure thing. But as pretty legit candidates to be number one receivers. And again, I think, especially in Cleveland, you're not going to get – how else are they going to get a number one receiver in this offense with this quarterback situation?
The guys aren't going to want to come to town, right?
They don't want to come here.
Yeah.
So you have to – I think you have to draft one. And like you said, they shouldn't be picking this high. They hope for a while. And if Wilson or London are sitting there, I just think it matches up in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I'm with you, Doug. I don't see how, at least one of those guys isn't there, if not two.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, they're not going to have three receivers picked in the first 12. No. A couple quarterbacks are going to jump up like always. There is certainly a crop of edge rushers that people are going to want to take. There's a couple corners that are going to go as always, like you guys said. So I just really think there's about a 50-50 chance that Wilson gets to them. And I feel like maybe one receiver goes before them, and it might be Wilson or London. I think it would be great if it's like Jamison Williams or like a speed guy, because I just don't think that's the right fit for them. So let the Jets or the Giants take Jamison Williams and give the Browns a choice of Wilson or London. But I also would be happy for the Browns if, one of Wilson or London is gone and they take whoever's left.
That would work.
I'd be okay with that. Yeah. I'd also be okay with them trading down and taking somebody, at the wide receiver spot if they could pick up another second round pick somewhere. So, real quick, if let's take another position. And I know Rod wanted to ask about some of the other Ohio State players. Tight end is also a problem, I think, with the Browns organization. So you've got Charlie Kolar out of Iowa State. I'm just curious how you see him matching up against Jeremy Ruckert.
Yeah, listen, Ruckert is, have written and talked a ton about Ruckert since he got to Ohio State. He was a top 100 national recruit, played receiver in high school, knew he was coming here to be a tight end. They acted like they were going to throw him the ball, and like every other tight end in Ohio State history, they didn't throw him the ball. So they had three such good receivers. They use their slot receiver to work the middle of the field. And if your choice is Jackson Smith and Jigba or anybody else, you're going to pick Jackson Smith and Jigba, who played in the slot this year. So I thought it was nuts how little they threw the ball to Ruckert, especially down the stretch. I think it was almost an insult to him because he could have come out last year. It might have been a little bit of a stretch, but, he stayed for his senior year and got ignored down the stretch. He's turned into a really good blocker. He's a really good athlete. You can see his highlight plays, the one-handed catches in some big games. I think he's that kind of guy. He had a good Senior Bowl. But now I also think it's possible he's so underrated he might get overrated. And I don't want to hold against him the fact that he had whatever it was, 26 catches this year. And Charlie Kolar had 62, I think it was, for Iowa State. But Ruckert in the third round. And I know Dan Labbe for us did his mock draft that came out Wednesday, and he had him picking Ruckert in the third round.
Okay.
I don't think that's wrong. Jeff Hireman and Nick Vannett, two, Ohio State tight ends from 7-8 years ago, both went in the third round. And I think Ruckert's a better receiver than both of them. So I could see the third round, but there are just some guys I like better. So I'm not against Ruckert by any means. And he really is a good blocker. He wasn't when he got to Ohio State, but he became one. And he does have good hands. I just think there might be a couple tight ends I like more. But you got to give Kev a tight end, right, man? I mean, come on. He'll storm out of the draft.
And again, I think this is a great draft to be looking for a tight end with some upside.
Yeah.
especially in the mid rounds.
Yeah.
So I sure hope they come away with one.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, it's like Hooper is such a big dead cap hit if they get off him this year, right? So it's hard to imagine the scenario where he's not on the team this year. And I hope, the Hooper contract situation wouldn't keep them from signing Njoku if they want to sign Njoku. But I think Harrison Bryant is fine. He's okay. But I think a world where in 2023, your two best tight ends are David Njoku and maybe the guy you take in the third round this year, that might be a better place for the Browns than where they are with tight ends right now. So I do think that is an interesting position to keep in mind in the third round.
I think that's an interesting statement, Doug, about David Njoku. I mean, to your point earlier about Baker not being extended, David Njoku, we've mentioned several times, it wasn't extended either. So why are we assuming that the Browns want to re-sign him?
I don't think we're assuming it. I think a lot of this, we all end up having conversations about, should they sign him? Will they sign him? And it's like, well, what's the number? Like all of it is like, will they re-sign? Like, well, what's the number? Is Clowney 2 for 28 or is Clowney 1 for 11? Like that's not the same discussion. So I do think it's possible. I mean, if the little hiccup there with Njoku in 2020, I think maybe contributed to the fact that they didn't lock him up previously, but he was their best tight end this year. And he certainly has come a long way as a blocker. And he remains the most tantalizing upside guy. I mean, it's a little bit crazy to be thinking about a guy who's, been in the league now as long as he has. And you still like the number one thing with him is potential, but he's still so young.
Yeah.
And at some point you have to become more than potential, but he's 25 and a 5-year veteran. So if you're trying to find your George Kittle or your Mark Andrews, I don't think that's
a no-brainer.
I don't, of the guys on the roster, Njoku by far is the best chance to develop toward a top end tight end. And that might be the thing. It's like Kevin Stefanski likes tight ends, but man, what would Kevin Stefanski do with a top 5 tight end? What if he had Travis Kelce? Well, what if you have somebody who can approach the fringe of that production on your roster and you're going to let him walk because you overpaid Austin Hooper a couple of years ago? So I don't know. I mean, it's you might end up spending an awful lot on tight end for 1 year, but you sign Njoku now, you suck it up, you get off Hooper after this year. I think it might be worthwhile. And I don't know. A lot of times guys think they're going to go find a huge market, but is somebody out there really dying to give David Njoku huge numbers? Nobody knows him better than the Browns.
I don't think so.
Yeah, probably not.
I don't think so.
He might want to test the waters, and then he'll get a little bit of a dose of reality and then sign a contract with the Browns that is good for him, but also good for the team.
Yeah. So, Doug, I want to ask about Chris Olave because I don't know if it's just me. It feels like he's been on the Buckeyes for like 6 or 7 years. He's been playing for a long time. He also seems to be a guy who is people are, either really high on or not very high on at all in this draft. So what are your thoughts on Chris Olave?
I think he's smooth. I think he's a good route runner. I think he's a great guy. I think he works hard. I think he's a really good deep threat. I think he plays the ball in the air. He's a little bit like Devin Smith, I think, who was a second-round pick for Ohio State in 2015. He's a better overall receiver than him because he's not only a deep threat, and Devin Smith was really kind of only a deep threat. He's not, I don't think, as dynamic as Wilson. And whenever we talked about Wilson and Olave the past 2 years, we always kind of thought, well, you maybe could make an argument that Olave is, quote, better, maybe, but we just think Wilson's the better draft prospect. And I think that's going to play out and has been playing out, with what draft analysts are saying so far. I think for sure he should be a first rounder. He's a little bit of a smaller frame. But I could see him being the kind of guy, if he goes to a team that has a good quarterback and a good number one receiver, and you drop him in as the number 2, I think he could light it up for you right away. I think that, for the Browns to draft him and say, you're our guy, I just think that might be a bit of a heavy lift for him. So I'd like it. I would love to see him paired with Justin Fields, because Justin Fields is throws a pretty good deep ball, and he and Olave had a nice connection. And people have noted, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Devontae Smith and Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa and Jalen Waddle. It's like pair up your receiver and your quarterback from college, but the Bears don't have a first round pick because they traded up for Fields. I actually saw a mock the other day that had Olave falling to the Bears at 39, and that seems like a stretch to me. That seems a little far, like if Jahan Dotson goes ahead of him, and it is a good receiver class, but I still think he's a first rounder, but I think he might slightly be more of a number 2 receiver in the NFL, where I do think the top 3 guys to me are more clear number 1 receivers. But I like Chris Olave a lot.
Let's combine a few guys here, so we're not going one at a time here. Just some guys on the defensive line. Haskell Garrett and Jackson are the DTs, and then Tyrek Smith, defensive end. How high are you on each of those guys?
Yeah, I mean, Antoine Jackson, I think is kind of a guy. I think I can see him being a late round pick. Haskell Garrett was a big time recruit, a little bit of a slow developer, then turned into an All-American. I think he is a good football player. Sometimes you see these super athletic, gigantic guys at defensive tackle, like the Georgia guys. He's not that. So I wouldn't go too high on him. I just think he's more of a day 3 guy. If I know the Browns do have a defensive tackle need, like Haskell Garrett in 3rd round seems a little high to me. Tyrek Smith is interesting. Cleveland Heights kid, big time recruit. Injury issues kind of his whole career at Ohio State, but there were times this year when he was healthy, when he was the best player on the defense. And I do think he had a good Senior Bowl, which was not a surprise. And I'll be curious to see what he does at the Combine, because I do think he's a guy who, were he healthier more consistently, would have put up better numbers and might be projected higher. I mentioned him briefly when I had Boy Mafe in the 3rd round of the Browns. I could see Tyrek Smith getting into day 2, because I do think he's athletic. He has good size. I think he's a really good football player. He's got fresh legs a little bit because he was there for 4 years, but he did have the injuries that he battled. And you don't just want to draft Ohio State guys and Cleveland guys, but I think he's a really good player, and I think it's possible. Draymond Jones, another Cleveland guy, was drafted as a 3rd rounder. He's a tackle, but drafted by the Broncos as a 3rd rounder a couple years ago. I think a really good player, a pretty darn good player for the Broncos. Jonathan Cooper was a 7th round pick last year, played a lot, decent amount for the Broncos as a rookie this year. I think Tyrek is a guy who could play good football for you. And if the Browns, for instance, drafted him, I think he could be their 3rd defensive end, maybe pretty quickly. I don't think you'd say, Clowney's gone, we're going to start Tyrek Smith. But I think he could fill that Tack McKinley role if Tack's coming back from his injury. So I think I like him. He's a good player, and he might be underrated.
So about the tackles, Thayer Mumford and Nicholas Petit-Ferrer.
Yeah,
I know Nicholas is getting probably a lot more press right now.
Yeah, Munford probably is more of a guard. 4-year starter, great story, great dude. I was just trying to think. He reminds me a little bit of Jamarco Jones, who was a 2-year starter at tackle for Ohio State, a 5th round pick a couple years ago by Seattle, has started some games. Munford's a little bit of they moved him inside this year, they said, to help give him versatility and stuff. But I do think legitimately he's probably a guard in the NFL. Jack Mehort was a guy who was a tackle at Ohio State. I think he was a 2nd round pick by Indy and went to guard right away. So I think he projects as like a good guard. But, I think 4th, 5th round, but I think he could play for a while. Petit-Ferrer that guy's a 5-star recruit, top 10 national player, good feet, was really slight when he got to Ohio State. Every story about him at Ohio State when he got here was how they're making him eat and put on pounds because he was so skinny. So that's one of those things, he's got the frame, but he had to grow into his body a little bit, but that means he's a good athlete. And he had a really good year. They didn't have a great game against the Michigan edge rushers in losing to Michigan, but a lot of people didn't have great games against Aiden Hutchinson and David Ojabo this year. So that's no great slight. there was a time with the way Petit Frere was playing halfway through the year, I thought this guy could be a first round pick. It feels like that's not where he's going now, but I think he is a NFL starter, and I would guess he's probably a second round guy, maybe could slide into the third. But I think from the moment he got to Ohio State, we thought he was an NFL tackle, and I think the way he's played the last 2 years, he's certainly shown that.
Nice. And then defensive backs, DeMario McCall, the corner, and Marcus Williamson, the safety.
Yeah, not players. They won't be drafted.
They will not be drafted.
No.
Is Master T going to be drafted?
No.
I didn't think so. Yeah,
yeah.
So, excellent. Jeff, do you have anything else you want to add about the draft real quick before we kind of head on out of here?
No, I think we covered it all really well. I appreciate folks' time.
All right. Yeah, really appreciate your time, Doug. Anything you'd like to leave the listeners with tonight?
Wide receiver or bust, baby. Get ready. If you hear an explosion in Berea on draft night, it's because the Browns have not taken a receiver at 13. So
it's going to be from you.
I can be persuaded off that point. If Devontae Adams shows up in a Browns uniform in free agency, but short of that, they cannot get to September without a number one receiver. And it just reminds me of, when they were building up this team in free agency 2 years ago, and it was like, hey, they have everything they need except a left tackle. It's like, I wonder what they'll do. And it's like, well, they're going to draft a left tackle. So, Andrew Berry knows the roster better than any of us, obviously. He knows they don't have those guys. And I do think we've been talking about this. Do you guys both think Jarvis Landry will not be a Brown next year?
I think we've both reached that conclusion.
Yeah. I agree. He will not be.
Emotionally, it's I get it, but nobody thinks he'll be back at $16 million. And if you restructure, I have a hard time finding the number that would make both sides happy to make it happen. And then I also would imagine a reduced role. So I think the Browns' number one and number two receivers for the 2022 season are not on the roster right now. So
I agree.
Makes free agency and the draft very, very interesting.
Yep.
Totally agree. Okay, that is Doug Lesmerises. Follow him at Doug Lesmerises. Check him out at all of his stuff at cleveland.com. And also check out the link to his book and his podcasts, as we talked about earlier, Buckeye Talk Pod and CFB Survivor Show. Jeff, any closing words tonight?
Not tonight, Rod. I'm tired. Doug wore me out.
Okay.
That's my podcasting strategy, is wear down the other people.
Wear them down.
Wear down the others. Doug wins this bout. So this has been the Browns Blitz. We will catch you next time.